Ahead of this emergency energy summit tomorrow, more analysis now with the energy expert from the Climate Council, Andrew Stock. Climate Councillor and energy expert Andrew Stock joins me now from Adelaide. Andrew, thanks very much for your time. I want to start by getting your reaction to the government's warning, and this is going to be put to the states, particularly the Labor states tomorrow by Josh Frydenberg, that an aggressive push into renewables will risk further blackouts like we saw in South Australia last week.
So what we know, Kieran, is that with climate change that we're now living through, we're going to see more intense storms. The cause of climate change is emissions from fossil power stations. And Australia's fossil fuel power stations are some of the oldest, most obsolete and dirtiest in the OECD. So I guess climate change and energy security are two sides of the one coin. And although there might be debate about renewable policies, what we've got to see is consensus, because without consensus, we won't get investment to modernise our power plant fleet, to make our transmission infrastructure more secure and our energy supply more secure, and also modernise that fleet for the challenges of the 21st century.
And where do you think that consensus should be, and should it extend to harmonising the renewable energy targets around the nation, where at the moment we've got a bit of a patchwork of targets? Should that be harmonised?
So the key target for investment across Australia now is the renewable energy target. It's a federal target. I think where the debate is about whether that target is aspirational enough, given the challenges the nation needs to meet in terms of reducing its emissions. By 2030, we've got to cut our emissions from where they were in 2005 by about a quarter, 26 to 28%. And all of the modelling says that to stay under 2 degrees, our nation's emissions in the power sector need to go to zero by 2050. So we've got power plant that's almost 50 years old in some cases. So we've got to realise that's got to change and be replaced. At the same time, we've got to make it fit for purpose. So policy targets that the states are talking about are more broadly consistent with what's needed to put us on a trajectory to get to our 2030 commitments.
So they're consistent with the Paris Agreement, which incidentally comes into force effectively as of November, because enough nations in terms of emissions as part of the percentage of global emissions have now ratified Paris. But to get there, the states' targets, you say, are more in line with that. But are they realistic in the sense of having also baseload, consistent, confidence in baseload power?
So without getting into the detail of the power system, what we had in South Australia last week was a failure caused by wild storms. 1 in 50-year storms that seem to be occurring these days, more like 1 every 2 or 3 years. So a fundamental thing for energy security is to ensure that the infrastructure is robust and modern. None of us would run our households on fleets that are, a car that's 30 or 40 years old, a fridge that's 50 years old, or a TV, that's a black and white TV. That's what we've got in quite a bit of our power plant fleet today. So we need to modernise that fleet. Whether it's baseload, intermediate or peak is a question that the market will deliver. What's really important from a policy point of view is that we ensure that we get consistent policy settings so that capital, the private sector capital, can come into this market and make the investments that are going to be needed. Because the investments will be in the billions of dollars. The technologies are there today, frankly, to do this. They're getting cheaper all the time, and yes, a lot of them are renewables, but there's batteries. There are other low carbon solutions around. Very conventional things like pumped hydro storage, for example. Lots of solutions that can be brought to bear, but one thing we also know is that if we have policy uncertainty or policy flip-flop, what we won't get is capital investment by the private sector. And that's the last thing Australia needs.
What about coal-fired power? Already the Minerals Council argues that there is technology for new generation power stations, with hundreds being built in Asia at the moment, as we speak, that they are already emitting 50% less in terms of CO2 emissions. As a transition, why do you not think that that is viable as we move to a greater percentage of renewables?
So over my working career, I've built a lot of power stations, around 3,000 megawatts. And what that tells me is that it takes about 10 years to permit a power station, get it built and run it. And then it's got to run for its operating life, and for those assets it's 50 years or more, or up to 50 years. So with a large coal-fired power station, even if it were substantially lower in terms of its emissions, if you were to replace half of Australia's coal-fired fleet with new power stations running on coal, we would blow our budget for carbon emissions, our share of the global budget, for 2 degrees. So it's not actually a viable solution, and the Minerals Council was reported in today's press as saying that, well, a new coal-fired plant produces as much emissions as an open-cycle gas-fired plant. The reality is that no one in Australia, or around the world for that matter, run open-cycle gas-fired plant base load. They are peaking plants, they don't run base load, so even by that comparison, technology to technology, clean coal, so-called, is not clean. I think the other aspect, Kieran, here is that who are the private sector investors that are going to take the carbon risk associated with building a major infrastructure asset like that, centred on coal in this country, where they're going to wear that risk, their shareholders are going to wear that risk for the next 50 years. I think that's a major issue as well, that private capital will certainly look at and price in its consideration of whether or not it would choose to make that sort of investment. So I think there are a lot of issues here.
Yeah, there's the other energy source, though, that we don't often refer to in this debate, but you're in the state where there are 25% of the world's reserves of uranium. Why don't we discuss nuclear power, given its zero emissions and baseload power? Why is that never part of the mix in terms of our debate here?
Well, I think that's a very broad question, and the South Australian government has shown quite a deal of leadership last year in commissioning a Royal Commission to look into all facets of the nuclear fuel cycle. That commissioner, through an extensive process, concluded that it probably didn't make sense for South Australia to look at nuclear power at this time. But, you know, nuclear power stations tend to be relatively large, and so if they are going to supply a large amount of base load, the places to talk about building them would be on the eastern seaboard, somewhere near major population centres like Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane. And I think that sort of discussion would be somewhat problematic from a social licence point of view. I'm not sure the Australian community is yet ready to accept having large-scale nuclear power plants relatively close to urban centres. And I think as last week's storms in South Australia showed, we can't afford to have large power stations distant from urban demand, because the risk is, with more severe climate, more severe storms, that transmission infrastructure could fail. And if it does fail, we've got a nuclear power plant providing base load, but it can't get to the market where the people are. So I think that whole question of nuclear is something that would be quite a long debate, and then you've got to permit it, and then you've got to build it. So I think we would be looking at probably 2030 at the earliest before nuclear would have a role to play in this country.
And my final question relates to a policy that was in place and now no longer, but it relates to the renewable energy target, because the question I want to ask you, Andrew Stock, is it that we've got somewhat of a hybrid situation in terms of our approach here that wasn't really the intent of the renewable energy target, that was always meant to be alongside a carbon price, of which, as we well know, doesn't exist now?
That's right, and in the longer term, the carbon price was meant to provide the long-term support for zero carbon projects like renewables. Now, we don't have that, so post-2030, we have nothing in this country in terms of power emission aspirations that are deliverable. We need to fix that, because we are going to need to make further investments, whether it's renewables or low emission power solutions. We as a country are going to need to face up to the fact that by 2030 a good proportion of our power plant fleet will be well over 50 years old. And it's not in our national interests to have that fleet running and driving our economy. It would be like driving our economy, a modern economy, with a clapped out car, and none of our households do that, and we shouldn't be planning to do that in the power sector. So we need some solutions, some policy objectives that drive incentives for low emissions and drive this change also for technologies that can provide support to intermittency, that can diversify sources of supply, and all of those things will also increase resilience. So there's a lot to be done, and frankly not that much time to do it.
Climate Councillor and energy expert Andrew Stock, appreciate your time this Thursday. Thank you.
Thank you, Kieran.
And that's all for the program tonight.